I watched the harbour clear while my orders stayed silent. The stations ahead had stopped answering and no one told me to move. Every day I waited, the distance grew heavier than the sea. When I finally turned north, I knew the system would notice, only after it was too late. On the southern edge of British Columbia, facing the grey swells of the Pacific, the small port town of Prince Rupert maintained a quiet but vital role in the Allied war effort during 1942. Situated just south of the Alaska Panhandle, the port served as a logistical node in the early operations along the North Pacific coast. Though distant from the major European or Pacific theatres, its harbour received and dispatched tonnage that supported both domestic coastal needs and military preparations for contingencies in the north. By late spring of that year, Allied military planners had become increasingly wary of Japanese expansion across the Pacific. After the fall of the Philippines and the advance through Southeast Asia, attention shifted to the Aleutians, an island chain stretching from Alaska westward toward Asia. These islands were remote, battered by storms, sparsely inhabited, and difficult to supply. But in the event of Japanese naval activity in the North Pacific, they could become both vulnerable outposts and strategic footholds. At Prince Rupert, vessels tasked with delivering supplies, personnel, and communications equipment to scattered outposts further north departed under careful scheduling. Many of the ships were small and civilian crewed, often repurposed coastal steamers and fishing boats refitted for military use. The Canadian military presence in the area remained limited, and the Royal Canadian Navy focused on escorting larger convoys in the Atlantic. Coastal supply duties fell largely to the Department of Transport, the Royal Canadian Corps of Signals, and private mariners under contract. One such vessel was the SS Comox Provider, a wooden-hulled supply boat converted from a pre-war fisheries tender. Registered under the federal fleet but operated by civilian hands, she was typical of the makeshift logistical apparatus used along the western seaboard. Her routes included stops at Port Hardy, Bella and more distant outposts near the Dixon entrance. Her master, Hugh Lennox, was 54 years old, a veteran mariner with decades of experience navigating the labyrinthine channels and inlets of the British Columbian coast. Lennox was known for his meticulous routines and unhurried manner. He had no military background, no formal commission, and little interest in strategic discussions. His focus was practical: weather, tides, engine reliability, and the unpredictable loading schedules of remote docks. In May 1942, Lennox prepared for a scheduled departure northward to deliver radio equipment and rations to several small stations established under the Joint Services Coastal Warning System. These installations, operated cooperatively by Canadian and American personnel, monitored coastal traffic and atmospheric conditions. While not combat posts, their reporting function made them essential to early warning protocols. The Comox Provider was to depart on a Monday morning. By Saturday afternoon, most of her cargo had been loaded, and the two-man engine crew reported the vessel seaworthy. But as Sunday passed, Lennox remained aboard, reviewing manifests and tidal charts. The ship's boiler had developed a minor pressure fluctuation the previous week, which had been partially addressed but not fully resolved. Though no longer under explicit mechanical restriction, Lennox had noted a low humming noise during warm-up cycles. The sound was not violent or irregular, merely different, and different was enough for him to pause. At the docks, a junior representative from the Department of Transport inquired about the delay. Lennox replied simply that conditions were not ideal. The weather was clear, the tides favourable, but he stated that he would wait until Tuesday. There was no protest. While the routes were considered important, there was little central oversight or redundancy. Each master was responsible for his vessel and cargo, and coastal operations tolerated a degree of autonomy. The small crew remained aboard, performing maintenance and routine checks. The radio operator tested frequencies for the receiving stations and updated logs. The days passed quietly, with the mild air of late spring carrying the smell of salt and spruce through the narrow town streets. By Monday evening, the town's only defence garrison, comprised mostly of reserve infantry, held a brief drill exercise, its echoes heard distantly from the hilltop. On Tuesday morning, a light fog moved in from the sea. Lennox remained ashore longer than usual, visiting the meteorological office and speaking with a weather observer about low-pressure systems forming near the Queen Charlotte Islands. Though no severe storm had been forecast, the reports mentioned shifting winds. Still no official warning had been issued. By midday, the dockside activity had slowed. The Comox Provider remained tied at berth, her small stack giving off only faint traces of residual warmth. Her departure time passed with no announcement. When asked again, Lennox said he intended to leave early Wednesday instead. Again, no objection was raised. But further north, events had begun to change the calculations. On the Aleutian island of Attu, American military personnel began reporting unusual radio traffic late on Tuesday. Japanese vessels had not yet appeared, but naval intelligence had detected heightened communication between Yokosuka-based units and unknown recipients in the North Pacific. Whether it was routine noise or preparation was unclear. At the small Canadian outposts further up the coast, ones awaiting the Comox provider, radio silence began to grow. It was not the silence of cut cables or enemy interdiction, but rather the prolonged quiet of stations operating at the edge of their endurance. Several lacked sufficient battery power for consistent transmission. Others were hampered by poor antenna positioning due to terrain. The stations were manned by 2- or 3-person teams, some of whom were young conscripts trained only briefly in technical protocols. By Wednesday morning, fog returned in greater thickness, and visibility dropped sharply across the harbour. The Comox provider remained in port. Lennox, after conferring again with the weather office, delayed once more. This time the delay was met with mild concern. A field report from a remote warning station at Langara Island, just south of the Alaska border, had failed to arrive. It was not yet considered an emergency, but the routine daily confirmation had not been received. In normal conditions, such delays might be due to atmospheric interference or operator fatigue. But taken with other missed signals, 2 in the last week, questions were raised among Signal Corps staff. With only a handful of vessels tasked to resupply and rotate station personnel, any delay compounded quickly across the network. Prince Rupert's modest operations room noted the gaps, though no clear directive followed. Resources were stretched thin. Lennox, for his part, remained steady. On Thursday, he authorised a partial engine test and rechecked provisions. But word had begun to circulate about unusual naval activity along the Aleutian chain. Though the reports were unconfirmed, American authorities had notified Canadian counterparts of possible reconnaissance overflights near Dutch Harbour. If true, the northward sea lanes could soon be under threat, not from blockades, but from isolation. If even a handful of outposts fell out of communication for days, it would take weeks to re-establish reliable oversight. In the quiet of the dockside barracks, a corporal assigned to message dispatch noted that the Comox provider had not reported outbound. He filed an update. At the same time, the senior officer responsible for coordinating small vessel movements northward issued a polite query to Lennox's office, asking not for explanation, but for estimated departure. No alarm had yet sounded. But for the isolated outposts above the 54th parallel, where the Pacific coast gave way to rock and forest, the pause was beginning to stretch. By the morning of Friday, May 29, 1942, the harbour at Prince Rupert remained shrouded in intermittent fog. Visibility fluctuated between a few hundred metres and barely the length of a ship's mast. The Comox provider, still tied up at its wharf, had now missed 4 consecutive scheduled departure windows. Though the vessel's delay had not caused immediate disruption to the town's routines, murmurs among port staff, Signal Corps officers and civilian contractors had grown more pointed. Quiet discussions emerged behind office doors and along loading docks, all circling the same question. Why was a routine supply mission stretching into a full week of inaction? Hugh Lennox, as always, offered no dramatic justification. His answers remained grounded in technicalities: engine checks, valve testing, barometric trends. His ship's boiler pressure had stabilized and the engine crew now believed the vessel could safely complete its run. Yet Lennox remained unconvinced by technical sufficiency alone. He had noted a growing number of communication irregularities from the receiving stations and suspected that something broader was at play, though no formal briefing had reached him. His instincts, forged through decades of navigating Pacific waters, told him that uncertainty, not failure, was the true hazard now. North of Prince Rupert, at a chain of isolated listening and relay posts along the coast and islands, silence deepened. The station at Langara Island had now missed 2 daily reports. Cape St. James, on the southern tip of Haida Gwaii, transmitted partial weather readings, but no personnel confirmation. The Gowan Bay post, situated along a tidal channel only reachable by boat, acknowledged receipt of signals but sent nothing in return. These posts were designed to be simple, resilient and nearly invisible. Their purpose was not to fight but to listen and to warn. The Joint Services Coastal Warning System, a cooperative initiative launched the previous year, depended on a fragile framework of interlinked reporting stations, staffed primarily by communications personnel and amateur radio operators drawn into service. Their training had been brief. Their equipment was basic: battery-powered transceivers, field antennas, and paper logs. Their only lifeline was the periodic arrival of vessels like the Comox provider, which delivered food, spare parts, and, just as critically, reassurance that their work had not been forgotten. By the end of the week, the station logs at Prince Rupert's communications office revealed a troubling pattern. Of the 12 northern reporting stations scheduled for contact that week, 5 had failed to send confirmations for more than 48 hours. A 6th had responded only with a string of garbled characters, possibly interference, possibly damage. The remaining stations sent abbreviated updates, their tone increasingly strained. In one, an operator at Lucy Island signed off with a brief addendum. Rations low, battery voltage falling, requesting timetable. Despite these developments, no formal escalation procedures were initiated. The doctrine for such interruptions emphasized patience, citing past experience with weather-induced radio blackouts and limited personnel availability. In Ottawa and Victoria, oversight offices received summaries but issued no immediate orders. In Washington, American naval intelligence remained preoccupied with rising tensions in the Central Pacific. The chain of command, designed to ensure deliberate responses, now imposed a form of inertia. Lennox received none of this in full detail, but fragments reached him. A junior signal officer, frustrated by the lack of action, casually shared several omissions in the latest station logs while visiting the dock to inspect loading manifests. He made no accusations, just observations. Lennox listened. He knew the distances involved. He knew which stations depended most on consistent resupply, and he knew that the farther north his ship travelled, the thinner the lines of support would become. By Saturday, word reached Prince Rupert that Japanese forces had made amphibious landings in the Aleutian Islands. Though not officially confirmed by Ottawa or Washington, the reports came from American patrol aircraft and coastal radar teams. The targets were the islands of Attu and Kiska, remote, unfortified, and lightly inhabited. For Allied planners, these landings were unexpected, but not entirely shocking. The North Pacific had always been a vulnerable flank. Yet for the small group of operators along the British Columbia and Alaska coasts, the development shifted the nature of their work from precaution to exposure. With no standing orders to recall or reinforce coastal warning stations, local officers began informally re-evaluating their positions. One liaison officer quietly cancelled a planned rotation of personnel northward. Another requested additional field radios from depot inventory, though no delivery date was set. The gaps in communication were now framed less as technical difficulties and more as early signs of isolation. Still, Lennox received no formal directive to depart. His cargo, communications gear, fuel drums, basic rations, and spare batteries remained intact. The ship was now fully prepared, its delay growing increasingly difficult to justify in operational terms. The Transport Office, under pressure from Victoria to explain supply interruptions, sent a second query by telegram: "Status of Comox provider, please advise." Lennox responded via typed reply. Awaiting forecast clarification and route confirmation, departure expected soon. It was not a refusal. But it was not an affirmation either. On Sunday, the first replacement crew member for the Gowan Bay station arrived in Prince Rupert, expecting immediate transfer. He was 22, newly trained, and carried a rucksack containing 2 days' worth of food and a Morse code manual. He waited at the dock, unaware that the vessel scheduled to carry him north had not moved in a week. When told of the delay, he returned to temporary quarters and was advised to remain on standby. At the same time, inland telephone cables delivered updated intelligence summaries to regional posts. Japanese submarine activity had been observed off the coast of Oregon. Civilian shipping between Seattle and Anchorage had been suspended indefinitely. American military commands in Alaska issued readiness orders for all coastal posts. Canadian authorities, though less formally coordinated, took notice. The pressure increased, but still no departure. By Monday, weather conditions had stabilized. The fog lifted. Visibility improved. The barometer steadied. At a meeting of coastal operations officers in a small administrative building near the dock, a proposal was raised to redirect another vessel, smaller and less heavily loaded, to cover part of the Comox provider's route. The proposal was logged but not implemented. The region's capacity was limited, and few alternate craft were seaworthy or crewed. It was during this lull, when clarity returned and the delay could no longer be ascribed to nature, that concern finally reached a higher register. The regional controller of naval operations, based in Esquimalt, sent a formal memorandum requesting an update on station resupply status. For the first time, the issue was framed in terms of operational risk, not technical delay. Lennox read the notice. He acknowledged receipt, but no departure occurred that day. In the absence of any single catastrophic event, the situation had now evolved into one defined by accumulations, missed messages, unconfirmed posts, growing seedlets, and an idle vessel watched from the shoreline. By Tuesday evening, a report arrived from a Canadian fisheries patrol operating off the coast near the Queen Charlottes. The patrol had attempted radio contact with a shore station near Barry Inlet, but received no response. After anchoring offshore for 2 hours, they spotted no activity. No flag, no smoke, no light. They left without making landfall. The entry in their logbook read only, "No contact. Assume non-operational." By the first days of June in 42, the operational picture along Canada's North Pacific coast had shifted decisively, though without any single moment of announcement. The Japanese landings on Attu and Kiska were now confirmed through American channels. Naval communiques circulated between Washington, Ottawa, and regional commands, acknowledging for the first time that enemy forces had established a physical presence on North American territory. The Aleutian campaign, previously a matter of contingency planning, had become active. Yet for the scattered coastal warning stations stretching southward from Alaska, little changed in practical terms. No reinforcements arrived, no evacuation orders were issued. The men at these posts continued their routines as best they could, monitoring frequencies, logging weather, scanning horizons, while supplies dwindled and equipment degraded. Their isolation, long considered an acceptable risk, was now exposed as a structural weakness. At Prince Rupert, the accumulation of missed reports had forced a reassessment. The Communications Office compiled a consolidated status sheet showing that 8 stations were either overdue or unresponsive. Of these, 3 had not transmitted for more than 5 days. The explanations once offered, atmospheric interference, operator illness, power failure, were no longer sufficient. The pattern suggested systemic disruption. The responsibility for response remained diffuse. Naval authorities controlled threat assessments. The Department of Transport oversaw civilian vessels. The Army Signals Branch monitored communications. No single office held direct authority to compel action across all domains. In this environment, decisions were deferred, revised, or diluted. Hugh Lennox stood outside this structure. As master of a government-chartered vessel, he answered technically to the Department of Transport, but operationally to no one. His orders were schedules, not commands. His accountability was defined by safety and delivery, not by strategy. Yet the longer the Comox provider remained idle, the more his role drifted from routine transport towards something less clearly defined. On Wednesday, June 3rd, Lennox requested a private conversation with the senior transport officer assigned to Prince Rupert. The meeting took place in a sparsely furnished office overlooking the docks. There was no record of the conversation beyond a brief note in the officer's diary. Discussed readiness and northern route viability. No minutes were taken, no directive was issued. What can be inferred is limited. Lennox had reviewed the latest station status summaries. He knew which posts had gone silent and for how long. He understood the geography well enough to recognize which routes were most exposed and which stations lacked redundancy. And he was aware, through informal channels, that American patrols were encountering resistance in the Aleutians. The risk, as he saw it, was no longer hypothetical. If Japanese naval forces chose to probe southward along the coast, the warning stations were the only early detection system in place. Their silence would not merely delay reporting, it would erase it. Resupplying them under hostile conditions would become exponentially more difficult. Waiting for formal instructions might mean waiting too long. That afternoon, Lennox returned to his vessel and ordered the crew to prepare for departure within 48 hours. The instruction was not shared with port authorities, nor was it formally logged. It was a preparatory step, reversible and provisional. The engines were warmed, fuel levels were confirmed, Cargo was resecured. At the same time, a message arrived from Esquimalt requesting updated estimates on the station resupply timelines. The request was routed through administrative channels and did not reach Lennox directly. By the time it was processed, the assumptions it relied upon were already outdated. Thursday brought clear weather and calm seas. Visibility extended far beyond the harbour entrance. The conditions Lennox had cited for delay were no longer present. Dock workers noted the increased activity aboard the Comox Provider. Lines were checked, the radio antenna was raised. Provisions were inventoried one final time. Still no official sailing order arrived. The unofficial nature of Lennox's preparation was deliberate. He understood that departing without explicit coordination could create complications. He also understood that waiting for coordination might render the mission irrelevant. The distinction between initiative and insubordination was thin, but not undefined. As master, he retained discretion over his vessel's movements so long as safety was maintained, and no standing prohibition existed. On Friday morning, a partial transmission was received from the station at Lucy Island. The message was brief and weak, likely sent at reduced power. It reported battery failure, limited food remaining, and no relief in sight. The transmission ended abruptly. This message did reach Lennox. A copy was circulated among senior port staff and one was delivered to the Comox Provider by hand. Lennox read it in silence. There was no dramatic response, no raised voice. He folded the paper and placed it in his chart drawer. That afternoon he informed his crew that departure would occur at first light on Saturday. No exceptions were mentioned. The crew acknowledged without comment. Most had suspected this decision was coming. The departure plan deviated from the original schedule. Rather than following the full northward route, Lennox intended to make initial landfall at the nearest silent station before proceeding further. This adjustment was not approved by any authority, but neither was it prohibited. It represented a practical response to incomplete information. In making this decision, Lennox accepted several risks. The Comox Provider was lightly armed, carrying no defensive equipment beyond small arms. Escort vessels were unavailable. Intelligence on enemy movement along the coast was fragmentary at best, and once underway, communication with Prince Rupert would be intermittent. Yet the greater risk, in Lennox's estimation, was inaction. By nightfall, the vessel was fully prepared. Dock workers finished their tasks and departed. The harbour quieted. From the deck, the shoreline lights of Prince Rupert glowed steadily, unchanged by the broader shifts underway in the North Pacific. Lennox remained aboard, reviewing charts one final time. The decision had been made, but its implications were not yet clear. Whether his action would restore a broken link, encounter resistance, or arrive too late was unknowable. What was certain was that the margin for delay had narrowed. The Comox Provider departed Prince Rupert at 5:12 hours on Saturday, June 6, 1942. No ceremony marked her exit. No formal announcement accompanied the departure. A handwritten note was left at the dock office indicating northbound route as per standing cargo manifest. It was unsigned. The harbour was still, the tide favourable, and the fog absent. Her bow turned steadily into the Dixon entrance, the gateway to the outer coastal passages that ran northward through disputed channels and narrow fjords. On board, Hugh Lennox monitored the vessel's course himself. The ship's wireless operator, Thomas Reardon, a 27-year-old civilian radioman trained under wartime emergency procedures, attempted to maintain scheduled contact intervals with the Prince Rupert Signal Office, but conditions were poor. The farther north they travelled, the fewer relays were available. Most northern stations could not respond at all. By Sunday afternoon, the Comox Provider reached the vicinity of Langara Island. According to the last partial transmission, the coastal warning station there had been low on supplies and battery power. Lennox anchored in a sheltered bay and sent a small boat ashore, crewed by Reardon and a deckhand. They carried a field set and 3 boxes of provisions. The station was abandoned. Logs were scattered. A broken antenna mast lay beside the entrance. A note had been left in the doorframe, short, almost apologetic. It indicated that on June 1st, with power nearly gone and no radio contact re-established, the team had hiked inland, intending to reach a fishing camp known to the lead operator. No coordinates were given, no further trace was found. The boat crew spent 3 hours searching the area before returning. Lennox entered the station himself and reviewed the logbook. The final entry read, "Signal failed. No word. Will attempt relocation. It was dated 5 days earlier. With Langara Island inoperable and its team unaccounted for, Lennox adjusted course toward Lucy Island, where the most recent, albeit faint, transmission had originated. The approach required cautious navigation through tight, unmarked passages. On arrival late Monday morning, the station was found occupied, but barely functioning. The two operators, both under 25, had rigged a makeshift aerial and were using a hand-crank generator to power the transmitter. Their faces were gaunt. They had been without substantial food for 3 days and without contact for nearly a week. The batteries had failed entirely. Their emergency flare kit was water-damaged. One operator's hands were bandaged crudely, the result of an electrical arc while attempting repairs. Lennox delivered rations, replacement batteries, and a sealed envelope from Prince Rupert Command. The young men offered no complaint, only fatigue. They had not known whether relief was coming. Reardon helped re-establish the radio set using components from the cargo hold. Within 2 hours, Lucy Island transmitted a stable signal for the first time in 6 days. That same day, south of their position, the Royal Canadian Navy issued an operational clarification to its regional commands. Given growing Japanese activity in the Aleutians and the demonstrated vulnerability of outposts, all coastal vessels operating north of Port Hardy were to coordinate departure and arrival logs directly with naval liaison officers. It was the first directive of its kind, but it came too late to apply to the Comox provider. At the same time, an inquiry was launched into the handling of Northern Station logistics. Internal memoranda from the Department of Transport indicated concern over vessel accountability and possible deviation from assigned protocols. One cable, circulated among senior staff in Victoria, read, "Unauthorised movements by civilian vessels, while perhaps well-intentioned, present a coordination hazard. Strongly recommend review of command structure for future missions." In practical terms, however, there were no alternative vessels available for immediate deployment. The Comox provider had accomplished what no other transport had in 10 days, re-established live contact with an outpost and confirmed the abandonment of another. Whatever violations of bureaucratic structure Lennox had committed, the operational result was undeniable. Still, pressure mounted. On June 9th, while the Comox provider proceeded towards the Cape St. James, a formal complaint was filed from within the Regional Transport Office, citing failure to report deviation from scheduled route and absence of authorization for modified resupply plan. Though the complaint acknowledged the delivery successes, it criticized the unilateral nature of the action. A review board was proposed. Lennox was not informed. At sea, such developments remained distant. At Cape St. James, the vessel encountered more severe conditions: high winds, erratic swell, limited anchorage. The station's signal was weak but present. Supplies were transferred by rope cradle in heavy surf. During the operation, one crate of batteries slipped and fell into the sea. It was the only loss of cargo during the mission. Upon return to Prince Rupert on June 12th, the Comox provider docked without ceremony. The vessel had been gone 6 days. Lennox submitted a simple report: list of stations reached, supplies delivered, and observations made. He did not offer explanation for the delay in departure or the modification of the route. That same day, a junior officer met him at the dock with a typed letter requesting his appearance at a scheduled review board hearing to discuss procedural deviations. The tone was formal. The location was Victoria. Travel arrangements were to be made at government expense. For Lennox, the summons was neither unexpected nor particularly concerning. He had delivered his cargo, supported his crew, and restored communications, but the letter underscored the deeper tension now becoming visible between the demands of structured wartime bureaucracy and the lived realities of service in remote, loosely governed territories. In the days that followed, word of the Comox provider's voyage spread quietly among coastal personnel. Signal corpsmen, dock crews, and junior officers spoke of the relief mission not in heroic terms, but as a point of reference, proof that timely action was possible when waiting no longer served the mission. But within administrative circles, a different conversation took place, one about boundaries, orders, and accountability. The hearing convened in Victoria on June 20, 1942. It took place in a modest government office used for internal reviews, not courts martial. The panel consisted of 2 senior officers from the Department of Transport, one representative from the Royal Canadian Corps of Signals, and an observer from the Royal Canadian Navy. The session was not public. nor was it reported in any newspaper. Captain Hugh Lennox sat quietly at the end of the table, uniformed in civilian maritime dress as required, his cap placed respectfully before him. He answered questions with precision but little elaboration. When asked to explain his delay in departure, he referred to the mechanical anomalies and adverse forecast conditions noted in his original logs. When questioned about his modified route, he cited his assessment of signal station silence and the absence of contradictory instructions. At no point did he express regret. The panel did not seek to reprimand him formally. There were no charges, only recommendations. The report issued afterward acknowledged the success of the mission, but concluded that Lennox had acted outside the established expectations for vessel coordination under wartime administration. A note was added to his file, but no action was taken to suspend or reassign him. No official recognition or commendation was offered. Back in Prince Rupert, operations continued. Within 2 weeks, several of the warning stations had received additional supplies through newly coordinated efforts between Canadian and American commands. A handful were reinforced with military personnel, others were closed entirely, deemed too remote to justify further exposure. The Comox provider was refitted for inland routes and reassigned to lighter duties south of Vancouver Island. Lennox remained in service but was never again tasked with northern missions. By early 1943, coastal warning operations had been consolidated under a more formal joint structure. The ad hoc approach of early war months gave way to tighter coordination, clearer authority, and stricter control of civilian vessels. Among those who worked the docks at Prince Rupert or manned the radios in isolated cabins, the voyage of the Comox provider became a quiet reference point. Not a legend, not a story of heroism, but a memory of when routine logistics and unsanctioned judgment bridged the gap between silence and continuity. The men at Lucy Island resumed their duties with regular transmissions. The team that left Langara Island was eventually located, dehydrated but alive, by a fisheries patrol weeks later. Their abandoned post was never reactivated. Lennox retired from service in 1945, returning to his home along the Sunshine Coast. He was not formally decorated. No newspaper mentioned his work. His name appears only briefly in wartime maritime records, listed under coastal resupply operations. Yet among those who remembered the days of weak signals and absent orders, his decision to act, however unofficial, remained intact, recorded in the ledgers not of command but of conduct.